Alright, so as you saw in the last video, we got the 9-inch all trussed up. The little intro roll was me welding up these trailing arms here. So now we're gonna get this 4-link set up on the Tacoma. Since this is a double cab, we're actually gonna be stretching the wheelbase to a standard bed, not that little 5-foot bed that they run, because we like to put our fuel cell storage and all that stuff in here. So we're moving the wheelbase back about 1 foot, just like my personal truck. So this is how we start. Basically, get our axle center line measured off of the back of the cab here. So we go 33 inches back, and then now we're gonna have to square up the axle so we can get the distance from bearing to frame, cross measure, everything else to make sure the axle is perfectly square before we get these lower links in position, so you make sure that the truck drives straight down the road. Alright, so we got the axle all squared up here, lined up. We did cross measurements from a hole on the frame that's even on both sides to the end of the axle housing here. So that got an axle all square. Now we're going to get our lower links right here, all bolted up to the mount. The wife cleaned up the frame real nice, so we'll get the links on, and then once the links are on here, we will swing the axle or the link up, put it on a jack stand, and then tack the bushing at the correct angle. So the links aren't perfectly parallel to the frame. They're going to be wider on the end because you want to get that axle or the trailing arm as close to the end of the axle as possible with not hitting the tire, because you need as much shock clearance to the frame as possible, especially on these Tacomas. The frames are really wide, so unless you're back halfing it and narrowing the frame, you need to get that as close as possible. Ours is set where the outer link tab to bearing cap is 4 inches. That's good for these links that I make with a 4 3/4 backspace wheel. It gives you about 1 inch of clearance. So now we will get the links in and get the link mounts roughly in place on the frame, get the bushings on, grind the angle on the trailing arms, and get them all tacked in place. Alright, so once you get the trailing arm on there, you need to double check that your axle is still in position. If everything's good, what I do is I just tighten up the jack stands. It keeps the axle kind of wedged in there so nothing moves when you swing the link up and have to move everything. And then you make sure that your axle's still square, so we can get these mounts tacked to the frame, bushings tacked to the trailing arms, so then we can start cycling the suspension, get the upper link mounts in. Alright, so we got the link in here, we got the jack stand under it. Basically just position it to where it's right below the frame. What I do is I stack up a bunch of washers on the link mount here. Basically you can get these washers right up against the bottom of the frame, and it'll keep it so you can still get a socket and everything on the nut. If you only have one washer, it'll get caught in this roll and you'll end up too high. So that's why I put usually 3 or 4. And now we get this positioned. These link mounts are designed where the upper part of the mount will be parallel to the bottom of the frame. So we get this positioned here, nice and tight against the trailing arm. And then now we just gotta get the welder and clamps and get this thing clamped in place. Alright guys, so we got the lower link mounts on, we got the top of the links leveled, mounts clamped, tacked in place, all that's still in good position. So now what we're going to do is place the upper link mounts These link mounts are designed with the angle built into them, so we don't have to drill through the frame or any of that stuff. So we plugged in the numbers into our 4-link calculator based off this mount lining up with this existing hole in the frame. We use this hole because there's one on both sides, so it's easy to get everything square. Visually, you can just put this link mount up here, level it to the top of the frame, make it so you can barely see the hole sticking through, and then you can tack it and you know the mounts will be even left and right. So we'll get that in there. We'll lower down the axle, get our pinion angle set, and then we'll measure for our upper links, build those, remove cross members, do whatever we need to do, and then we'll cycle this suspension to make sure the numbers match what we have in the 4-link calculator and what we want. So so as you saw, we got the axle lowered down to ride height. How we figured ride height was we measured from ground to center of the front hub at ride height, did it here, calculated how high off of the ground the cab was compared to at ride height, did some math, figured out we need to be at 22 inches from the ground to the center of the housing. So we got it put on these 2 jack stands. Now that we got it on those jack stands, we need to square up the axle again and then set our pinion angle. Alright, so we got all the heims and spacers and bungs and jam nuts and all that stuff here. What we do on the upper links is we run a left hand thread on one side, a right hand thread on the other, so it'll be like a tie rod so you can adjust it. If we're building a race vehicle, we will run right hands only because the upper links have a tendency to loosen a lot less often. But this is just a play truck, so this will make it easier to adjust pinion angle and everything else down the road. So we'll just get these assembled and then take some measurements to see how long to cut the upper link tubes. Alright, so we got these all put together. What I do is bottom them out fully, and then I rotate them 4 turns out on all ends, so then they're all even. So we'll just, you know, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll get that set. Then measure from center line to edge of the bung, 4 inches. So we're at 52.5 minus 4 minus 4, 1 for each end. So 48, 44.5. That's how long our tube will be. So as you saw low, just cut the tubes, drilled the plug welds. The reason we do a plug or a rosette weld is instead of the weld being in tension or compression, that weld could shear. So when you have a plug weld here, you physically would have to rip this plug weld through all that tubing to get that bung out of there. So you always make sure you do a plug or a rosette weld when installing the tube adapters or the weld-in bungs. It's just a good habit. We also ground a slight bevel on the end of the tubes. It just gives you a little more room for penetration on the welds. Gives you a little better weld. So we're just gonna get this tacked together, throw them under the truck, cycle it with our angle finder on there to check our pinion angle, do some measurements at droop and bump to check our drive line for plunge. And then if all those numbers are good, we'll tear down everything from the rear end, weld the bushing on the trailing arm, weld up these upper link, weld all the mounts, then our 4 links set and it's ready for the customer to mount the shocks, bumps, back half, all that stuff. so we got the upper links all on, everything's cycled. This truck has a double cardan CV style driveline, so you want that pinion angle to stay in line. So we run a slightly longer upper link than normal, which will get us that pinion angle to roll, almost like a radius arm style setup. Just so it'll keep that driveline perfectly in line and not have any vibration throughout the travel. Right now, over like 24 inches of travel, cycle's just where it needs to be, so we're happy with that. So we're gonna get this all tore down and
Alright guys, so as you can see, Tommy finished up welding the mounts to the frame. While he did that, I put the heims on the upper link mounts and the bushings on the trailing arms. Now that everything's all cooled off, we're gonna put everything back together.
Alright guys, so you just saw me bolt up the 9-inch third member. Didn't have enough copper washers, so I had to get some more of those, so we'll finish tightening that up later. Got the axles put in, some spacers to match the thickness of the factory drum brake backing plate since we were running a weld-on disc brake brackets. And then we have the Escalade rotors on here. They have the same 3.1-inch brake pilot that matches the Dutchman axles. They're the correct width for the GM calipers. So we'll get these all assembled, welded on here in a minute. Alright guys, so what you saw me just do there is use some compressed air to compress the piston, essentially like the brake fluid would be doing, and that holds the pads and everything square so that I could get this bracket tacked up. The benefit of using these GM calipers is they are a floating caliper, so if something is off a little bit or gets warped, it does square up pretty well. The bushings will wear out prematurely, but since these are rear brakes, they'll probably last the lifetime of this truck, honestly. So now we got to pull everything back off, pull the axles back out, because when we are welding, we're close to that bearing and seal. We don't want to damage any of that. So we'll get everything tore apart, get it all welded. I'll throw one corner gusset to keep the caliper mount from warping, and then we'll be done with this part.